Welcome back, viewers. Jumping back into this great conversation with John Lane. Once again, John, how are you today?
Yeah, well, thanks. And you, Louis?
Doing just fine. John, I got some good feedback on our program of last week where we talked about Pope Marcellinus and the situation surrounding him and some of the historical details that we tried to clarify along the way. And we're going to continue that sort of theme. One of the other popes that's often pointed to as an example of bad popes that in some way make the popes that we've been living through since the council look a little bit more pontifical, if you will, is the story of Pope Liberius and the matter of the Arian crisis. In fact, one of the more noteworthy of the conservative bishops out there, a man that I've often referred to as the best of a sorry lot, for lack of a better description, Bishop Athanasius Schneider, who by all accounts seems to want to at least have the Catholic faith and inject some clarity into the situation today. He wrote an essay or an open letter, you might call it, back in April of 2016 in reaction to Amoris Laetitia, a starkly stunning, erroneous text from Pope Francis. And he writes in there, and I'm going to read from his text. He says, taking due account of historical and doctrinal differences, our situation shows some parallels and analogies with the general confusion caused by the Arian crisis in the 4th century. And he goes on to talk about how there was a lot of ambiguity and precise language being used by different bishops throughout the church at that time. They were avoiding use of the very clear description of Christ and his relationship with his Father that came from Nicaea, consubstantialem, as we say it in Latin, or homoousios in Greek. And he says that Liberius signed an ambiguous formulation which eliminated the term consubstantialem. And he said the Pope, in a scandalous move, excommunicate St. Athanasius. And I think most of our viewers are somewhat familiar with this story. And I want to ask you, just how historically accurate is the perception that most traditionalist Catholics have today of the story of Liberius and the Arian crisis?
Yeah, it's a big question, Louis. So most traditionalists will hold views similar to those suggested by Bishop Athanasius Schneider, who I think he's a beautiful soul, but he's got a long way to go in terms of clarifying his thinking and working out what's happened to the church. He has little idea at this stage. Most traditionalists hold those views because Michael Davis, the biography or the defender of Archbishop Lefebvre, in which he did a great job, had read Newman writing as an Anglican 12 years before his conversion in his book, The Arians of the 4th Century. And Davis believed it, and he had a false picture. And he spread that picture through articles in the Remnant, through pamphlets, through books, incorporating the story in various books he wrote. He even wrote a whole book on St. Athanasius and retailed the fact that Liberius fell and that he condemned, excommunicated Athanasius. Most traditionalists could probably recite the basic ideas presented by Davis in their sleep. And in addition to that is this pernicious notion that Newman expressed in the Arians of the 4th century, that what happened was essentially the bishops failed in their profession of faith, but the ordinary faithful persisted in holding to the faith despite the bishops. And he used this phrase, which became famous, that there was a temporary suspense of the ecclesia docens, okay, so the teaching church. Now, after his conversion, Newman expressed this same idea in the pages of the Rambler, which was a liberal Catholic magazine in England. And this got him in trouble in Rome. And he was forced, there was a big controversy, and Newman was forced eventually to retract, and he resigned from the Rambler. And in fact, the Rambler failed as a result, ultimately, a short time later. So this was considered poison in Rome. And it's a heterodox idea. It was expressed by him as an Anglican. He hadn't got it out of his system when he was now a Catholic, and he found out the hard way that this was not an idea that was compatible with the Catholic faith. And yet Davis quotes it with approval.
So, John, just to make sure everybody's clear, what you're saying is that the general understanding, or misunderstanding in this case, of the story of Pope Liberius, that most traditional Catholics accept as being historically accurate, once again, came from a Protestant. In this case, Newman, 12 years before his conversion to the Catholic Church. There seems to be a recurring theme from last week. We talked about Marcellinus. The foundation for it was the Donatists, heretics who were at war with the Holy Catholic Church. Okay.
And of course, the story was kept alive once critical scholars really got to work on the story and realized that it was pretty thin. It was kept alive by Protestant controversialists and then anti-infabulist controversialists in the 19th century. I mean, it's a story. The St. Marcellinus legend was only maintained by enemies of the church. So yeah, that's right. And in the case of Newman, we had this sort of vague idea. Well, he was virtually a Catholic even when he was writing before he converted. Well, there's truth in that notion, right? Because he was heading for the church. But in that very book, the Arians of the 4th century, he says that the popes apostatized completely from the true faith at Trent. So he's maintaining a completely Protestant position in that book. So the idea that the bishops had failed, that the ecclesiodocians had failed in the 4th century, and that the faith was kept alive by the ordinary faithful, by the laity, was not alien to the spirit of Newman or of his book.
Yeah, that's stunning, John.
Anyway, I mean, Davis just didn't see it.
Yeah, it's absolutely stunning to know that at that same point in time, he accused the bishops of apostatizing at the Council of Trent, which is the most glorious event in the history of the church, according to most traditionalist Catholic thinking. Amazing.
Yeah. So that's what we're dealing with, right? So this Protestant idea and this Protestant interpretation of history has found its way into the mentality of many, if not most, traditionalists. It's an astounding, honestly. I never cease to be amazed when I see this stuff repeated. You see it repeated today on forums. Every second week you'll see it on a forum, on a traditional Catholic forum. You'll see it in the pages of the Remnant, and Davies' books are still popular, and it's just constantly being revived. So look, what I thought we could do is I've written a set of notes which are a potted history of the Arian crisis. Okay. Now, when I say this, I've written them. I've made the notes, but I've gotten them from a Catholic historian who wrote in the 19th century. This volume here, which is the second volume, I think, or the first volume of the Abbe Darius, Darras. So, this is volume 1. Of course it is. So that's the title page, and all I've done is read the 50 or 80 pages of Darius on the Arian crisis, 60, 70 years of church history, and while doing so, made notes of the key facts as they're presented by Darius. So this is not John Lane, this is not my interpretation, these are just the facts. So what I'd say to anybody who wants to debate this, let's first consider the facts and then talk about the interpretation. The only rational way to do it.
That sounds good. One question for you. What's the reputation of Darius as an historian in traditional Catholic circles? I mean, this is a very dependable source, you would say?
Pre-Vatican II, very, very high.
Right, okay.
Since Vatican II, oblivion.
Does he have his critics out there, this Darius, as a historian?
Don't believe so.
Yeah.
Don't believe so. No, very highly rated. He's like a Rohrbacher or any of the other standard Catholic historians who were serious and who wrote their history with the light of faith, very critical, and a really good thinker. And I'll read you a couple of passages from him later if we have time to give you an idea of how he approaches these things. Like on the story of Liberius, for example, he gives all the evidence in favour, all the evidence against the fall, and then gives his own opinion at the end. But he's given you all the data. So anyone reading it can form their own judgment, right? And they may or may not agree with Darius at the end, but they've got the data to do so. He's exhaustive, right? So he's really good. So in retailing the entire history of the crisis, I think he's equally good. He's solid. He's scientific, and he's unbiased in the sense that he's not interested in anything dishonest. But he's also not interested in believing calumnies against the church unless they're well secured, unless they're securely founded.
Gotcha. Okay, so we have this.
Calumnies, they're facts.
We have this general perception that people hold that's coming from the Protestant Newman at a time when he thought the church had apostatized at Trent, and you're going to give us a list of facts from Darius that will act as setting the record straight in a sense here as to what truly happened. Just the facts, and then we can discuss how what they tell us. Yeah, sounds great. Okay.
The Arian heresy was started by a priest called Darius. Okay, in Egypt, a local African council was immediately assembled by Saint Alexander, who was the patriarch of Alexandria in Egypt at the time, and this council condemned the heresy and excommunicated Darius. Darius went off. He didn't accept this, of course, and he went off to a friend of his called Eusebius of Nicomedia, and Eusebius of Nicomedia is probably the major figure in the entire history of the Arian crisis. He held the heresy of Darius, and he conspired against Orthodox prelates. Nicomedia, we must know, was the second city in the empire. It was the seat. So it's just near what's today Istanbul, in modern day Turkey, and it was the seat of Licinius. Now, the Roman Empire was ruled at that time by four men who'd split the empire between them. Licinius was one of the co-emperors, one of the Caesars, and his seat was Nicomedia. So Eusebius of Nicomedia was in a very strong position in terms of being able to get the ear of the emperor. The sister of Licinius was Constantia, who happened to be the sister of Constantine the Great as well, who was one of the other four at the time. So, and Eusebius of Nicomedia, who was a real court prelate, a courtier, he was friends with this woman, Constantia, which made him able to influence people, significant people. Licinius ended up in a war with Constantine, and Constantine defeated him and then united the empire. Constantia, his sister, survived, of course, and Eusebius of Nicomedia survived. Eusebius got into Constantine's ear and accused the Catholics of creating dissension in the empire, and Constantine, over a matter of words. Constantine wrote to the bishops demanding peace, and the Catholic bishops refused. They said, we can't have any truck with error, with heresy. The Pope, St. Sylvester, in cooperation with Constantine, called the Council of Nicaea. It condemned Arianism, and Constantine banished Darius and those who wouldn't subscribe to the Orthodox formula of Nicaea, the Creed of Nicaea. This produced 2 years of peace. But Constantia and Eusebius of Nicomedia were not done yet, and on her deathbed, Constantia recommended an Arian priest to her brother, Constantine, the emperor. This heretic, in turn, convinced Constantine the Council of Nicaea had mistakenly condemned Darius, who was therefore recalled from exile. Constantine, under the rubric of peace, demanded that the new patriarch of Alexandria, Athanasius, welcome Arius to his city. Athanasius politely, and it was polite, refused. The key Arian bishops were intruders in their sees, and the Catholics would have nothing to do with them. Indeed, this became the veritable pattern of the crisis as it unfolded. The Arians would expel by violence the Catholic bishop and intrude their man, or they would elect a heretic when the Catholic bishop died, or they would convene a council of heretics which would depose the Catholic ordinary and then impose an Arian. No principles were applied unless we consider mendacity, deception, and brute violence as principles. Constantine called 3 sort of tribunal councils, so councils that were meant to judge Athanasius. The first 2 were made up solely of Arians, and Athanasius refused to appear. But the third of them Athanasius was ordered to attend on pain of arrest by imperial troops, and the council was open to Catholics. So Catholic bishops came. So Athanasius went along with this and showed up. This council was held at Tyre. At Tyre, Athanasius was the defendant in a pseudo-trial in which he was subject to 4 or 5 despicable yet ridiculous charges, including murder and rape. He produced the supposedly murdered man, to the great amusement of the bishops there. And when the female accuser came out, and she was actually a consecrated virgin, so a nun, and she said her life had been ruined she was raped by Athanasius. Athanasius, knowing that she'd never seen him before, spoke quietly to one of his priests and had that priest say to her, in the presence of everybody, "You dare to accuse me?" She then said, "Oh, not only do I accuse you of this, but many other things." And she went on and ranted and raved.
And what a brilliant defense that was.
It was, and it brought the house down. So then the Arians, who were incensed by their discomfiture, actually tried to murder Athanasius on the spot and launched themselves on him. And the imperial troops rescued him and put him on a ship.
Wow.
The Arians then went to Constantine again, convinced him to exile Athanasius to Gaul, which he did, and to force St. Paul of Constantinople, the patriarch, to welcome Darius into the church. St. Paul refused and instead announced a prayer crusade and a 7-day fast for the faithful. On the eve of Darius's triumph, when he was supposed to be received in glory into the chief church, he was walking through the city with a crowd of followers, all celebrating with him, and he suddenly felt ill, and he asked to go aside. So he went into a room somewhere, and he was gone so long. Eventually, they opened the door and they found him lying in a pool of his blood, with his bowels had burst out of his body. So this discredited Darius in the eyes of most, as you can imagine, and it actually frightened the wits out of the Arian bishops, the intruders. But it didn't stop the problems. Constantine then was baptized just before he died. He passed away, and then the empire was divided into 3, one each part to each of his 3 sons. Constantine Jr. Restored the exiled Catholics to their sees, but Constans soon had Constantine Jr. murdered, and the empire was then in 2 parts. So Constantius in the east and Constans in the west.
John, I have a question for you, if I may.
Yeah.
So at the time of this council that's been put together at Tyre, where Athanasius is made accused of these horrendous falsehoods, who is the Pope at that time? Is Liberius Pope at that time?
No.
It's
So
still
the
Sylvester?
Pope at that time was Saint Sylvester.
Okay.
Then there was Pope Mark, I think, and then Pope Saint Julius, and then Liberius.
It's interesting to me that all of this is going on. Athanasius is being just abused greatly for just holding to the true faith, and yet we don't see any intervention by Saint Sylvester, and no one seems to be upset with him. He's not one of these guys that comes up in the list of bad popes who didn't do their duty. I find that a curious thing.
Well, of course, Sylvester called the Council of Nicaea. So, and the Council of Nicaea, declared for Athanasius. So Athanasius had the approval of Rome at that point.
Right, but from a distance here, it almost looks like like you would like to have maybe seen a little bit more enforcement on the Pope of Pope Saint Sylvester. He called Nicaea. It gave the true faith dogmatically. It defined our Lord's relationship with his Father. And while all hell is breaking loose there at Tyre, and Athanasius is being abused and beaten simply for holding what Nicaea taught, where's Pope Saint Sylvester in this mix? where's the enforcement coming from the Pope? It just looks like something's missing there.
Well, yeah, look, I don't think that's at all right, actually, because you've got to remember communications are very poor.
Okay.
So he's in Italy, and this is over in Tyre was Phoenicia. Basically modern day, is it Lebanon or Israel? But it's on the coast of the Mediterranean over there, and so these events wouldn't have even been known to Sylvester until after the fact.
Okay, that's a good point. So we're talking about there's probably months going to pass between the events of Tyre, or even if it's just weeks. There's a severe lag in reporting. I got you.
Yeah, that's right. And you can actually see, and what happened was the Arians, I mean, they were completely unscrupulous, right? So they, after their embarrassment at Tyre, they went to Constantine and convinced him to banish Athanasius. And you go, well, how the hell do they do that with charges like that have been exploded in their faces?
Mm-hmm.
What they did is they never mentioned those charges. They presented a completely false picture to Constantine of what had gone on at Tyre and came up with a new charge, which was that Constantine had interfered with grain ships coming from, that Athanasius had purchased some grain legitimately for the poor in Egypt. And they misrepresented this. They were able to show that Athanasius had acquired this grain, and they misrepresented this to Constantine as that he had tried to prevent the grain getting to Italy, getting to Constantinople, against the wishes of the emperor.
Mm.
So they just came up with a new calumny. They were very, very flexible. My point is, the way the story was told in Rome would have been who knows what, right? So Sylvester would have been sitting there getting conflicting and utterly incompatible reports from different sources and not knowing who to believe.
Right.
So that's the first thing, right? Is communications were poor, and these Greeks were great fabricators. So that's the first. And the second point is, of course, the Pope didn't govern the church like a 20th century Pope. He was the final appeal court or tribunal, if you like. There weren't regular encyclicals explaining the faith to the bishops, and there weren't communications weren't good enough to have the Pope intervening in local affairs, right? Unless he was asked. And in the case of Athanasius, he did appeal to Sylvester, and Sylvester called the Council of Nicaea. So, make sense?
It does. And that's an interesting point, John, because I've had it pointed out to me that Catholics in centuries past didn't, quote unquote, hang on every word from the popes. In other words, a faithful Catholic in some part of the world may just be living his Catholic life and perhaps never hear any words directly attributed to the Pope for years on end. Here in our day and age, and the communications tools that we have at our disposal, we're bombarded in a sense with communications from the Holy Father.
Yeah.
But the impression that's sometimes made is that the older Catholics had it better than we did. But I beg your pardon. I mean, I think our current modern means of communications allows the popes to more efficiently function in their true role, which is the teacher and the source of unity of faith in the church. That it's not a burden that he has these communications tools. It's actually a great blessing that allows the Pope to function more efficiently as the person that he is. Anyway,
Well, I think absolutely, and I think to hold any other view, you'd have to disagree with the popes of the last 150 years, because they certainly embraced these means of communication, and they certainly decided to teach the whole church more directly than previous popes had. And the encyclicals up until Vatican II, up until 1958, are every single one of them absolute gems.
Right, and that's more compatible with the nature of the papacy than a pope that really has limited direct access to his flock. So, I mean, we're blessed to be living in times like these, in a sense, when the Pope can get to us.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, so the next event that occurred was that So we have doubt now that the empire is under the two, right? And we have Constantius ruling in the east, and we have Constans ruling in the west. Okay. Constans was actually, despite the fact that he was a murderer, a fratricide, he favoured the Catholics and he restored Catholics to their. Well, Constantine really did that, Constantine Jr. But Constans wasn't too bad. But Constantius was really subject to the Arians. So Eusebius of Nicomedia, still going, he arranged an Arian council in Constantinople, supported by the emperor, and had St. Paul, the patriarch, deposed and exiled again. Eusebius then intruded himself into that great see. So now we've got an intruder in the see of Constantinople. Eusebius was faced with a restored Athanasius and decided to get rid of him once more. So Athanasius is back in Alexandria now from exile. A deposed Arian bishop consecrated a priest of ill repute, Pistus, to replace Athanasius in Alexandria, and after a failed appeal to Pope St. Julius in Rome, Eusebius assembled yet another conciliabulum of Arian heretics, this time at Antioch, where the emperor sat, to depose Athanasius. Pistus had such a bad reputation that they consecrated yet another bishop, Gregory of Cappadocia, as Patriarch of Alexandria. This creature went to Alexandria with an army, which raped the nuns, murdered religious, sacked the cathedral, and installed Gregory as Patriarch. These were not good people. And this idea that you sort of had this war of words and all the Catholic bishops sort of got confused and went along with Arianism, false picture. Okay. These were brutally violent people using the power of the state, imperial troops, to intrude usurpers into Catholic sees.
Right. And John, I find it interesting that some of the assaults against Athanasius had nothing to do with the doctrine of the church, like these allegations about preventing grain from being transported.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, these things are totally secular. You know, they have nothing to do with the faith, really.
Well, because they were designed to appeal to an emperor who wasn't that religious.
Right, and probably couldn't have cared less about the doctrine of the faith, but he was concerned about grain shipments. I got you.
Yeah. He became concerned about religion. Anyway, you'll hear. So Athanasius was again exiled, this time fleeing to Rome. St. Julius called a council and invited all the bishops, including the Arians. The Arians begged off attending with excuses, and the council restored St. Athanasius and the other exiled Catholics to their sees and condemned and deposed the usurpers. Eusebius died Dei Gratias, and the Catholics recalled St. Paul to Constantinople. So the faithful in Constantinople recalled their exiled patriarch. So that was Eusebius of Nicomedia. There are probably 5 Eusebiuses involved on the Arian side. There was Eusebius of Caesarea, another famous figure in this, who was very close to Eusebius of Nicomedia. But anyway, the Arian party was often just referred to as the Eusebians as a result. When so St. Paul, the Patriarch of Constantinople, gets recalled, and then the emperor was, again, the Arians got in his ear and said, no, you know, he's come back, you exiled him. So the emperor sent his troops to expel St. Paul. The Catholics defended him, they defended their patriarch, and they killed the prefect sent by the emperor. The emperor, in his rage, rode there on horseback over the mountains in winter himself, and he was going to burn Constantinople and punish the people. They managed to convince him not to by lots of entreaties. So instead, he just exiled St. Paul a third time and intruded an Arian, Mardonius, into the see. So then, after councils in both East and West, which respectively adhered to Catholic and Arian positions, a general council was called with the agreement of both emperors to be held at Sardica, which is now Sofia in Bulgaria. I guess that was regarded as neutral ground between the two emperors. The Arians were outnumbered and withdrew. The council adhered firmly to the faith of Nicaea, and even Constantius accepted the outcome. The Orthodox prelates, including St. Athanasius, still residing in Rome, were restored to their sees. That was in 347 AD. It it looks on the face of it to have been a general council of the church, but it's not listed as a general council because it didn't really decide anything new. It literally just reinforced the faith of Nicaea and restored people who'd been unjustly deposed from their sees. 3 years later, a civil war broke out in the empire, and Constantius gained the victory, uniting the empire under his sole authority. He immediately returned to the vomit of Arianism and had St. Paul exiled a fourth time, where he was murdered by his jailers. An intruder who was resisted by the faithful was again installed, and the faithful resisting him, the number of 3,000 was slaughtered in getting this guy into the seat of Patriarch Constantinople. And you see this again and again and again when you're reading this history. I mean, I'm not giving you all the detail, obviously. The Arians were the most violent, bloodthirsty people. And, when Michael Davis talks about this in a video that I watched of his talking about this stuff, he omits to mention this, and he mentions the fact that Catholics in those days were less pious than the Arians, and sometimes they murdered them. They obviously got this straight from Newman, right? Writing as an Anglican. It's astounding, Louis.
It's a vicious persecution that's going on, where blood's being shed left and right. It's not just a debate of words. It's far beyond that.
Exactly.
Wow.
Exactly. Athanasius' name then was yet again assaulted by the Arians, and Constantius, like his father Constantine the Great, eventually acceded to their calumnies. He wrote to the new Pope Liberius and asked him to condemn Athanasius. Liberius called a council at Rome, found Athanasius to be not merely innocent, but a glorious defender of the faith. Constantius replied with an edict of banishment against all who would not subscribe to the condemnation of Athanasius. Then Liberius called a council with the cooperation of Constantius at Milan, the seat of empire then. By confining the bishops in a hall, right? He had them under confinement, and threatening them with the imperial troops, Constantius secured the signatures of most of them to the condemnation of Athanasius. So they didn't subscribe to Arianism, but out of fear and whatever weakness, they did subscribe to the condemnation of Athanasius. Constantius then ordered a new exile of Athanasius, and his troops attacked the cathedral, filled with worshippers, slaughtering them, while some of the faithful managed to carry St. Athanasius to safety. The Arians raped the nuns, murdered the Catholics, and intruded yet another heretic into the See of Alexandria. 30 other bishops in Egypt alone, were replaced by Arian usurpers.
Wow.
Constantius, anticipating the English Protestants by over 1,000 years, then issued a decree equating the true faith with high treason, and the resulting persecution generated rivers of Christian blood. I mean, this was like a persecution under a pagan emperor. It was like something under Diocletian or, Nero. Constantius then exiled Pope Liberius for failing to condemn Athanasius. The exiled Catholic prelates sustained the battle by letter from their various places of suffering. Darius summarises this situation as, quote, whilst most of the legitimate bishops were lingering out a life of exile and intruded heretics held their sees, when, to use the energetic expression of St. Jerome, the whole world seemed to have waked up Arian.
Wow, that puts a whole lot of context behind that statement of St. Jerome, John. I want to tell viewers because it's unknown to them how much time you and I prepare for these episodes before we actually start talking about them. The things that you're telling our viewers and me today, it's brand new to me. I had no idea that the Arian crisis involved all of the things that we're discussing today. Very interesting.
Well, that's good. That's gratifying for me because I spent about 8 hours reading over the last few days and making these notes. Constantius engaged in then a veritable paroxysm of councils, and Sirmium was the site of numerous of these, so that it was a kind of permanent council headed up by the imperial theologian himself. Sirmium produced at least 10 professions of faith. They produced so many professions of faith that people got sick of it and said, can't we just have the faith that we used to have? They were just discrediting themselves,
Right, and I take for granted none of those 10 professions of faith were consonant with what was taught at the Council of Nicaea, correct? They were all...
Every single one of them omitted the word consubstantial, the homoouson. That was the key thing, right? It was to not have the faith of Nicaea or the Creed of Nicaea. So I just want to read you directly from Darius on the just two things. So the first one is from Bossuet. So if you're wanting someone with a Catholic mind on nearly everything, but someone who was anti the infallibility of the Pope, a Gallican, Bossuet is a good example, right? And here's what he says about the fall of Liberius. It is certain that Pope Liberius ended his long pontificate in communion with the holiest bishops of the Church, with a St. Athanasius, a St. Basil, and others of equal merit and reputation. We know that he is praised by St. Epiphanius and by St. Ambrose, who twice mentions him as Pope Liberius of holy memory. And in one of his works inserts entire, together with these expressions of praise, a sermon of this Pope, which celebrates the eternity, the omnipotence, in a word, the divinity of the Son of God, and his perfect equality with his Father. But the fact is certain that Liberius yielded only to open violence, and it is equally certain that he returned to his duty of his own accord. These two important facts should not be overlooked, since they remove the whole difficulty. It is well known by the constant testimony of St. Athanasius and of all contemporary writers that Constantius shed torrents of blood, and that those who opposed his will in the affair of Arianism had everything to dread from his anger, so obstinate was he in support of the heresy. I do not say this to excuse Liberius, but to call to mind that every act extorted by open violence is null by every title and protests against itself.
Wow. That's powerful. So John,
there's a reference to the torrents of blood. Yep. Now, interestingly, that very reference to Liberius actually falling, Bossuet himself instructed his editor to delete from the second edition of the book, because he said it was too uncertain. Now, Bossuet had spent 20 years reading and meditating to get to the bottom of the question, of whether Liberius really fell and what it meant, right? And after 20 years, he'd written that, and then he thought, no, it's not certain, and he had it deleted.
But even in the version where he supposes Liberius fell, he makes it clear that it happened under a severe persecution. And so once again, John, like in the conversation we had last week about Pope Marcellinus, we're not talking about a free act. Now, what would you say to those who would want to argue that point, that the presence of this severe persecution and the severe threat of violence in no way takes the edge off of the act? I've actually had that conversation with some individuals where they're unwilling to accept the persecution as removing freedom from the act and therefore culpability for having, acted as they did. What would you say to that?
Well, they don't think like Catholics. They could open any Catholic book, including those which hold for the fall of Liberius, and they all say the same thing. That's Bossuet, right? He's a Gallican when he's writing that. He's not defending the infallibility of the Pope. Right, and even he, I'm just saying, there's just no Catholic position that can't see what is a fundamental of moral theology, apart from anything else, which is that a human act has to be free to be a fully human act. Otherwise, if it's extorted, it just lacks the value of a normal human act. And obviously, teaching is a human act. I mean, this was an act of teaching anyway, but in its character, But it's a completely vacuous argument against the faith of Rome to cite this supposed fall.
Right. So, John, I guess my question to you is it debatable in any way, shape, or form that an act carried out under severe persecution is inculpable? It's not free. I mean, that seems like common sense to me. But so it's just not debatable,
Well,
is it?
no. Just you got to be careful you don't take it too far. We are given the grace to hold out under persecution.
Okay.
I mean, if we rashly run into a situation in which we're persecuted, we're not guaranteed the grace of martyrdom. But if we act prudently and avoid where we can, danger, and we find ourselves grabbed by the machine and put in a position where it's apostatize or die, or apostatize and suffer terrible tortures, we will be given the grace to hold out. So if we don't, it'll be our own fault. So no. The point is not that it's an inculpable failure. The point is that it's not a fully human act that, and therefore it can't constitute some authoritative teaching by the Roman Pontiff. That's all.
Okay, I understand now.
And also, Louis, in the external forum, the law of the church will there's a legal presumption, right, of guilt in the circumstance. So if you've posited the external act, the law will regard you as guilty and subject to excommunication. Right? Say you did, offer incense or whatever it might be, and that certainly was the law of the church at the time, and that is. So the lapsi, the people who did sacrifice, for example, in the persecutions under the pagan emperors, they were subject to long canonical penances.
Gotcha.
But nobody would have taken, say, that act as, say you had someone who was a confessor of the faith, and then he did that. Well, actually, Eusebius of Cordova did. A famous example. He didn't offer incense, but in the Arian crisis, he was a venerable bishop. He was 104 or something. He'd been at Nicaea. He'd been at Sardica. And in the end, he subscribed to – what did he actually do? He either subscribed to the condemnation – I think he subscribed to the condemnation of Athanasius. I can't remember now. But the answer given by a saint at the time, which just echoed through the world, was, well, either for 90 years he was in error, in which case what's his testimony worth? Or for 90 years he was right and he's only done this out of fear, in which case what's his testimony worth?
Right. I got you. So that's the key distinction that I wanted to draw out of you, which makes good sense to me. So the sin of not, holding firm in the face of a persecution is one thing, but in the event of such a failure, that does not make the act some sort of a teaching act. So we can't say that Pope Liberius was actively erring as Pope. He was simply failing as a member of the faithful who did not persevere in the face of a persecution.
That's it. And this is why Bossuet can say, well, this just doesn't stain the See of Rome.
Right.
He believes it's, at the point he's writing, he believes it's true. And he says, but it just can't. He says he's such a beautiful writer. I mean, Bossuet's one of the greatest rhetoricians in the history of the world. That's how great a writer he is. I mean, this is a guy who wrote the most beautiful words. You should read one or two of his sermons just to see what great writing's really like. And I can't read it in the original, but even in English, in a translation, honestly, he's like St. Augustine. It's just absolutely extraordinary.
So, John, just one more comment on this. Then, so we in this conversation about failing in the act of a persecution, here it's appropriate to make the distinction between the Pope acting as a private person and acting as the Roman Pontiff. His failure was a personal failure. It wasn't a failure on the part of the Roman pontificate.
Exactly.
Gotcha. Okay.
Exactly.
Great.
Yeah. I can't find it now because it's I haven't marked it, but he says that that no ship has been more traceless in crossing the sea than the See of Rome has been in leaving behind it an unsullied reputation in faith. In other words, you think about a ship passing through the water, and once the wake has settled, you just can't tell that the ship's ever been there. Well, he says, I use that as a metaphor for just how pure the wake of Rome is historically. That's what I mean by beautiful rhetoric. It just anyway. So that largely those largely the facts. I think we should just briefly talk about Sirmium and Rimini. So what happened was Liberius was in exile, and the emperor called two councils, one in the east, one in the west. Used violence on both of them. Had to use less in the east because most of the bishops there were intruded and they were Arians anyway, and got them to subscribe a profession of faith which omitted the consubstantial, the homoousion, and at Rimini, after he kept the bishops there for months in confinement, they were worried about what was happening to their dioceses while they were away. He threatened them, he cajoled them, he promised them, he threatened them some more, and eventually he managed to extract from them subscription, most of them, a subscription to a semi-Arian or to a profession of faith which omitted the consubstantial, and that was the key thing, right? Now, again, the Pope wasn't involved. In fact, he didn't call either of the councils, and he wasn't invited to Rimini, which is the one he would have been invited to. And when he heard what had happened, he immediately denounced condemned this profession of faith, and he demanded that the bishops who subscribed, some of them didn't subscribe to their credit, and they were sent into exile. I think St. Hilary was one of those. He ordered that under pain of loss of office, they had to recant. So they're the facts, Louis. That's basically and the Arian heresy really died with Constantius. I mean, once he was gone, you didn't have the emperor imposing it anymore, and his reign ended with this paroxysm of councils. I mean, just calling council left, right, and centre. And he just loved debating theology with his courtier bishops, just like his favourite hobby, you know. So I've got a series of questions here which I've written. Did the church reject heresy the moment it appeared? Yes. In Alexandria, the patriarch immediately called a council and condemned Darius the moment he started preaching heresy. Did the Roman pontiffs reject heresy every time they were appealed to? Yes, they did. No exceptions. Did Arianism rest on intellectual conviction or the power of the state? The power of the state. Did loads of Catholic bishops disappear into heresy? No. When we read about the bishops who were actual Arians, were they apostate Catholics or intruded usurpers? Intruded usurpers in nearly every case. And you've got exceptions like Eusebius of Caesarea, who was a Catholic, then an Arian, then a Catholic, and then an Arian again, and stayed Arian. So you could count him. When the Arians were deposed, did they hold? So when they were legally deposed, right? They were legally deposed by councils, etc., right, or by the Pope. When this happened, did they hold their sees legitimately up to that point, or were they being deposed from nothing? They were being deposed despite having no right or plausible claim. One of the problems we've got is people read this history and they read about deposition and they think that this is a legitimate bishop is being deposed. Just because someone's being deposed doesn't mean they hold the see.
Right, they were usurpers who were removed.
Yeah, and likewise, if someone's run out of the church on their own, like Nestorius, and then he's deposed legally, that doesn't mean he held the see up until he's deposed.
So the usurpers,
it's just the legal process.
Gotcha. For restoring,
it's a legal term.
Right. So the usurpers had no jurisdiction in those sees.
Oh, of course they didn't. Oh, no. No usurper had jurisdiction. Yeah.
But the impression that's made in the Michael Davies widely accepted version is that these Arian bishops were real bishops with jurisdiction who had fallen into Arianism, which what you're telling us is that's patently false.
Yeah. And then my final question, Did Liberius threaten the bishops who consented to the semi-Arian creed of Rimini with deposition if they didn't recant? Yes. So I would summarise that as, so let's talk about interpretation, okay? That history is the history of the state, the church reacting to heresy properly, got rid of it. Arius excommunicated. Day one virtually, gone, okay? He conspires with worldly people who were at the court, and he gets the state on side. The power of the state is then used to impose heretical prelates, in many cases by intruding them into Catholic sees and then exiling the Catholic bishops. And as I said, like 30 at a time in Egypt. I mean, you know, this wasn't a small effort. The popes at each point held fast, and in the case of Liberius, actually suffered terribly from his steadfastness. And the moment he was free, there he is, and you'd think if he had fallen, what a hypocrite in condemning the bishops of the West for doing apparently what he'd just done like the year before, with no act of sorrow on his part. No, look, I fully understand. I was in a similar position, but we can't excuse ourselves. We have to repent and do penance and restore our good names. None of that, because he hadn't done it. And so that's the picture. So this idea that the Arian crisis is parallel to the Vatican II crisis, it's only true in the sense that yes, there are widespread heretics in supposedly Catholic sees, but the cause and the origins of it and the continuing strength of the heresy in the two cases are utterly dissimilar, Louis. I think you'll agree. Right?
Sure.
You do not have the power of the state imposing heresy on the Vatican II Council,
right,
and you don't have the power of the state sustaining it. It's a conspiracy of modernists.
Right, and you didn't have a situation where Liberius is appointing Arian bishops to the various sees. That's not happening. He's appointing Catholic bishops who are then being run out of town and replaced by usurper.
Not only that, we have no evidence of any Twitter account held by Liberius.
Exactly.
So, yeah.
John, I want to read a couple of sentences to you from Bishop Schneider's treatment of the Arian crisis as he attempts to draw parallels between the Arian crisis and what's going on today. He writes, in 357, Pope Liberius signed one of the ambiguous formulations of Sirmium, in which the term homoousios was eliminated. Furthermore, the Pope, in a scandalous move, excommunicated St. Athanasius. I'd like you to comment on that.
Well, the chief evidence for Liberius excommunicating Athanasius is that that Athanasius himself, in a book he wrote and in a letter that we have, says that it happened. The difficulty is that both works were written before the exile and supposed fall of Liberius. So these are interpolations by another hand, right? So the works are authentic, but someone's intruded into those works, this false story, and fathered on Athanasius the testimony that it had actually occurred. It's impossible that in either of those works could Athanasius, he would have been writing about the future.
Is there any speculation as to who precisely entered that false testimony into the works of Athanasius?
Well, no, because this was rampant, Louis. St. Robert Bellarmine tells us that there were factories in the East for producing forged documents. You can read in the Fourth Council of Constantinople and in many other councils that the first thing they do when they get the acts of the previous councils is they debate whether they're authentic. And you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
They know that there are forged copies of everything out there, mutilated by the Eunomians or the Eutychians or the Nestorians or the Arians. The Oriental just doesn't have the respect for documents that Westerners have. And so when examining anything from the East, you're sort of half expecting that there'll be at least a partial forgery involved. That's literally how a scholar looks at it, a scholar who's Catholic anyway and awake to how things are. So, as I say, that's what Bellarmine's attitude was.
Does Darius comment on the origins of this false proposition that's attributed to Athanasius that he was excommunicated?
Oh, at length.
Okay.
At length. So to Darius, for example, he runs through, what he does is he runs through, you're talking about, he runs through the whole history of the supposed fall of Liberius. He gives all the evidence, adduced in favour of its historical reality, and then he gives all the arguments against. The fact is that the vast majority of serious Catholic scholars have found in favour of Liberius that he didn't fall at all, and he didn't condemn Athanasius. There's a few you can cite on the other side, but amongst them you've got people like von Hefele, who was the modernist. You've got Tillemont, who was a liberal. I mentioned Tillemont last week. He's a very serious historian, but a liberal, right? Duchenne, some of whose works are on the Index of Forbidden Books. So these are the sort of characters on the Catholic side who support the charge. And then on the other side, you've just got this big long list of the greatest of Catholic historians who reject it. But so Darius is just he's being incredibly fair by giving all the evidence both ways and then giving his own opinion. But I'll give you here. Let's have a look. So Darius makes the point that if Liberius had fallen, because Eusebius of Cordova had fallen, that's undoubted, and it scandalised the world. And of course, what did the Arians do? They trumpeted it. If Liberius had fallen, how come nobody trumpeted this?
So, John, I wanted just for a moment define what it means to be fallen in this particular scenario. What does that mean? If Liberius had fallen in what way?
Sid.
So are we talking about Liberius as, personally, or are we talking about the Roman pontificate falling?
Well, personally, but the scandal would have shaken people's respect for the Roman pontificate.
Okay.
That's, I guess, the fear. We have seen Darius, right? We have seen the scandal to which the fall of Eusebius gave rise, the advantage taken of it by the Arians, and the striking reply of Saint Fabadius of Argent, the one where he says, was he right for 90 years? Or was he wrong for 90 years? Yep. Now, if Liberius had likewise fallen, the scandal would have been much more horrible. The Arians would have proclaimed a greater triumph. Saint Fabadius would have found a much more urgent call for a reply. This utter silence on all hands, so Arian and Catholic, conclusively proves the nullity of the fact.
So, John, are you saying that according to Darius, Liberius did not sign one of the ambiguous formulations of Sirmium? Is that what he's saying?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Darius says it just didn't happen.
It's amazing because, John, as we started off this conversation, pretty much every traditionalist that I've ever encountered in discussions about Liberius assumes that it's an absolute fact that Liberius signed an ambiguous formulation. But what you're saying makes sense because if he had, the Arians would have been broadcasting it throughout the empire.
And they didn't.
And they did not. Well, that's just common sense. Interesting. Okay.
It is, and it sounds like an argument from silence. But when you've got all these other documents from the era, and they're all anyway. It's a remarkable silence. It's an absolutely amazing silence. Likewise, Louis, you can't hold the views that most traditionalists hold if you just pick up a standard Catholic work from before Vatican II, history book, and read it. You wouldn't arrive at those views. They didn't arrive at those views reading pre-Vatican II books. They arrived at those views reading The Remnant and reading Michael Davis.
That's amazing.
And they don't know they've been deceived.
I have to tell you, I'm stunned, honestly, John, and again, I'll repeat it for other viewers. I had no idea where we were going today with this conversation. I had an idea that you might clarify a thing or two about this story of Liberius. But we're not just talking about commenters on AKA Catholic who believe that Liberius signed an ambiguous formulation and then excommunicated St. Athanasius. We have Bishop Athanasius Schneider, who we both agree is a man who, he's a beautiful soul. But my goodness, he's speaking about this as if he knows for a fact this absolutely happened. And it didn't. Well, I would like to think
that's
that
outrageous, isn't it?
It's an outrage.
They should be saying,
it's an outrage.
People who want to maintain it, people who are sincerely convinced of its truth, if they have any honesty at all, right, and they know the data, and they obviously don't. They obviously don't know anything about it. They've just read Davis or the Remnant or something, right? If they knew anything about it, in other words, if they'd consulted a standard privy to seminary text history book or something like this, Darius, right? They would know that this is a fiercely controverted question as to whether the fall occurred, and it's not something you can rely on in controversy to maintain anything on, because the facts are in dispute. And you couldn't just tell the faithful, like he does, that this is a fact and then draw an interpretation. It's not an established fact. And as I say, most Catholic historians, certainly all the better ones, find Liberius innocent. They just say it didn't happen.
Right, and I also find it stunning that someone of the stature of Athanasius Schneider would lay this out as if it's a fact with absolutely no mention of the bloody persecution that was unfolding throughout these decades, which would at least, even if it's an untruth, would lend a bit of context to what Liberius allegedly did. But apart from that, John, I don't think we're just talking about differences of opinion here. We're talking about grave acts of calumny. Like, how dare we, from our position, point a finger at Pope Liberius and finger him for doing these things that apparently I think one would be hard-pressed to say he actually did. It's calumny, isn't it?
You'd be hard-pressed to arrive, if you're a rational and just person, you'd be hard-pressed to arrive at certitude that this happened. You'd be very hard-pressed, I think.
Wouldn't you call this calumny?
Because the arguments against are very, very strong. And that argument I just gave isn't even one of the main arguments. But here's what Darius says about Athanasius. So it may be objected that St. Athanasius refers to the fall of Liberius both in his apology against the Arians and in his history of the Arians, which latter work was addressed to the hermits. But it is universally granted that the apology against the Arians was written at the very latest in AD 350, 2 years before Liberius became Pope.
That settles it. I mean, I'm actually getting a bit angry when I'm hearing this. Keep going. I'm sorry.
The passage which speaks of his fall is then evidently a subsequent addition made by a strange and unskilful hand, for far from giving any force to the apology, it only makes it pointless and ridiculous. The history of the Arians was also written at a period prior to that of the supposed fall of Pope Liberius. This unfavourable passage is then another interpolation, equally unconnected with what precedes and what follows. But by whom could these interpolations have been made? We know that even during the lifetime of St. Athanasius, the Arians forged a letter in his name to Constantius. What they could do whilst he was still alive was certainly easier of accomplishment after his death. You'll like this, Louis. The very next sentence. Did not the Donatists invent a similar account of a fall on the part of Pope St. Marcellinus, which was long received, but which all critics now acknowledge as false?
Stunning. Yeah, and it's, like I said, John, hearing these things makes me angry that I've been deceived to the extent that I have. But what are you going to do?
That's it. So, but you've got to keep in mind, Louis, these people are deceived, right? And when I say that, most people haven't got the time for serious reading, or at least maybe they're not equipped, I don't know, or they can't get access to the books. They're on archive.org. You know, Darius, I think, is on archive.org. You could read the whole 3 volumes. It would only take you a few weeks, you know, at a normal pace of reading. You'd have a history of the church under your belt. You'd know when all the major events occurred. People don't do this. And then they want to argue about stuff. And it's so frustrating because you think it's obvious to someone who has done a bit of reading that they don't know what they're talking about.
Well,
They don't
John,
have a Catholic attitude.
stopping short of making any subjective judgments, I don't have that right. None of us do. But it's,
Hmm.
it's one thing to have an ordinary lay Catholic who really wants to find the truth being mistaken on this point because we've been misled by what appear to
Yep.
be credible characters. But for a Bishop
Yep.
Athanasius Schneider to repeat this as if it's historical fact without any context, I find that beyond the pale. I mean, I think it's columnists.
He's he thinks the new Mass is the liturgy of the Roman Church.
Well, I guess
He,
if you're going to buy that, I guess you'll buy pretty much anything. Okay.
so he doesn't strike me as I mean, he certainly strikes me as an intelligent man. I don't know that he's a brilliant man, and he certainly strikes me as a man with a very, very Catholic heart. But his head needs some restoration work. He's got to do some reading. He's got to. The main thing he's got to do is he's got to step outside the whole Novus Ordo environment and consider that, look, maybe the whole thing's wrong. Let me start from scratch and analyze it from the beginning, right?
Right. That attitude.
Unless he does that. Sorry?
Yeah, it's the attitude that we talked about last week that by the grace of God we should all hope to have, where we're just looking for the truth. We're not looking to support any particular theory or, explanation, but rather just a wide, eyes open wide, looking for the truth and the grace to embrace it when we find it. And John, thank you so much for running through this.
That's all right. Yeah, no, it's my pleasure. In a way, I must admit I was moved to tears nearly by some of the stories in Darius about this persecution. It's hard to remain unemotional when you read the story of these imperial troops intruding yet another heretic into a Catholic see. And along the way they outrage all the nuns and the Christian matrons, and murder people, and in Constantinople, in Alexandria, when in one of the occasions when they intruded a usurper there and kicked out Athanasius, they sacked the church and burnt all the sacred things. They just acted like complete pagans. I mean, it was just like a pagan assault, just absolutely horrifying. And so that's the true picture, imperial troops supporting a usurper, kicking out the saint, and the faithful are subjected to all this violence. And then we're told, oh, yeah, the bishops failed. The bishops went Arian, and the faithful held out. That's the Newman picture, right? And it's just false. It's just not how it was. How could the faithful hold out if they didn't have leadership?
Right,
well,
exactly.
They did have leadership. The bishops were writing from their exile to their flock. And most of the flock went along with the usurper, actually, is what happened in most cities. But the few faithful held out. And in those cases where, like in Alexandria under St. Paul, and in Constantinople under St. Paul, and Alexandria under St. Athanasius, the veneration for this man, for the respective patriarch, was so great that at any opportunity they showed their favour towards him, welcomed him back with great joy, etc., when he was able to return. But in many of the other cities, you didn't have a bishop of that status. So when he was exiled, he was probably writing to 10% of the flock who were still faithful,
right? Because
the rest of them just went along with the status quo.
Very
and that's how the world
John.
found itself Arian.
Right, exactly. Right? That's wonderful context. I greatly appreciate all the effort you put into this program today. I've gotten a lot out of it.
And again, Louis, it's exactly the same now in another respect, right? In a respect that they never, the opponents of Liberius, for example, or the opponents of Catholic history think, and that is that look at the numbers that have survived the assault of heresy in our era, right? It's a small remnant.
Right,
and we follow their leaders.
Right, and we have usurpers in pretty much every see in the United States, at least. Well, John, we've gone again, a little well beyond our hour, but for very good reason. And I think it was a great program. Thank you so much. And any final comments before we sign off?
No, that's it, Louis. Thank you very much, and I hope we do some good. I mean, somebody, if one person has their eyes open to, just enough to go and read themselves,
sure,
see if what we're saying is true.
Well, I can tell you unequivocally, at least one person, because you're looking at him. I got a whole lot out of this, and I appreciate it. Well, thank you, John. Look forward to connecting with you next week.
Okay, thanks, mate.
God bless you, brother.
Good night.
Good night.